rejoice in your disposition to argue the Vietnam question, especially when I recognize what an act of self-control this must involve.
It does.
Sure.
It really does.
Sure.
I mean, I think that this
and
is
you're
the
doing
kind of
very well.
issue
You're
where,
doing very well.
you know, sometimes I lose my temper. Maybe not tonight.
Maybe not tonight. Because if you would, I'd smash you in the goddamn face. You say in your book,
reason for not losing my temper.
You say the war is simply an obscenity, a depraved act by weak and miserable men,
including all of us, including myself,
well,
including every. That's the next sentence. Same sentence.
Sure, because you count everybody in the company of the guilty.
I think that's true in this case.
Yeah, but
see, one of the points I was
this is a sense of theological observation, isn't it?
No, I don't think so.
Because as somebody points out, if everybody's guilty of everything, then nobody's guilty of anything.
No, I don't. Well, no, I don't. I don't believe that. See, I think the point that I'm trying to make, and I think ought to be made, is that the real, at least to me, I say this elsewhere in the book, what seems to me a very, in a sense, terrifying aspect of our society and other societies is the equanimity and the detachment with which sane, reasonable, sensible people can observe such events. I think that's more terrifying than the occasional Hitler or LeMay or other that crops up. These people would not be able to operate were it not for this apathy and equanimity. And therefore I think that it's, in some sense, the sane and reasonable and tolerant people who share a very serious burden of guilt that they very easily throw on the shoulders of others who seem more extreme and more violent.
All right. My name is Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I'm joined, as always, by our super producer, Jake Appett, and our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World. The voice you just heard, well, one of the voices was the late William F. Buckley. Not a fan. And the other was the still alive Noam Chomsky. Managed to outlive Buckley, outlive Christopher, Hitchens, who we fell out with, outlive Henry Kissinger, right? So that is actually maybe a little glimmer of hope for a just universe there. But in fact, Professor Chomsky has a relatively new book out. Came out last year. That is co-written with our guest tonight, Nathan J. Robinson. So the book is called The Myth of American Idealism, How U.S. Foreign Policy Endangers the World. And it is exactly what it sounds like. My understanding is that, Nathan kind of came to Chomsky with the book. It's like kind of the idea they sort of work together on something that like really distills a lot of the kind of big arguments that Chomsky has made over the decades about a lot of these subjects, kind of going from Vietnam to Iraq to Palestine. And, I think, what is there to say? I think it's much more, I don't know more. I think it's way too relevant, as frankly as that clip. I don't know about you guys. I can't. I think the first time I watched that, I just thought it was funny because William F. Buckley is threatening to hit Chomsky, and I quote, "in the goddamn face," and. It's like, all right, great tight end of, conservative discourse there. But rewatching it now, right? It's hard not to think about Gaza.
Yeah, it was really sobering, and my mood changed from tickled at Buckley's kind of like impetuousness to like, oh fuck, Chomsky's right. He's describing what I'm going through right now. And maybe history doesn't exactly repeat itself, but some of the same themes pop up over and over again, as we discuss a lot. And yeah, it was actually kind of intense to hear Chomsky saying that in a video from so long ago.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, Professor Chomsky himself, sadly, these days is for the last year or so, especially, is really in no medical condition to do podcasts. But his co-author, Nathan J. Robinson, founding editor of Current Affairs magazine and a friend of mine, somebody who, even before I knew him, I really was a very regular reader and admirer of his work, is going to be joining us on tonight's show. And meanwhile, in the post game for GTAA patrons, we are going to be watching some of Jordan Peterson's Jubilee appearance, which is going to be tough watching, I'm sure, for us as critics of Peterson, because I think he really cleans up. I think it's a very I haven't seen it yet, but what I'm told, it's a very dignified and sort of intellectually rigorous performance that he put on.
Yeah, it's good timing with the Chomsky episode, because I think he really pushes the frontiers of the philosophy of language, right? Because Peterson's always like, "What do you mean by you? What do you mean by me? What do you mean by believe?" And he's really deconstructing, which it's not Chomsky's thing, but I'm sure Chomsky would appreciate what he.
Yeah, well, Chomsky is somebody who has made one kind of contribution to our study of language.
Yes.
And Peterson's apparently making another. So,
and I'm sure if we wrote him an email, we'd get a 30-page email back explaining to us about Jordan Peterson's deconstruction of the English language. So,
what's sad is, like, I just know Chomsky would have been down to come on the show with Nathan if he was feeling a little better. So, nice, sad, but nice to know he was so generous with his time.
No, man. I mean, a man has spent his career being absurdly generous with his time. I mean, I'm pretty sure since email existed, and probably up until sometime last year, like, if you sent the man an email, he would reply usually right away, right? I mean, like, I've experienced this. It was incredible, right? I mean,
most of my friends don't text back as fast as Chomsky was emailing.
No. I actually recently did hit inbox 0, and I felt just such a amazing swell of pride in myself for doing that. But I'm pretty sure Noam Chomsky, despite God knows how many emails he was getting every day, was somehow maintaining that for like decade after decade.
So, maybe he was just anal about being inbox 0. He's like, gotta get rid of these fucking. But he could have just deleted them. So we gotta give him some credit there.
Exactly. All right. Well, we are going to have much more to say about Chomsky later in the episode when we bring Nathan on. But two things first. One, I do just want to plug again, we are very soon starting the Capital Volume 2 class on the Patreon. So originally we were thinking, so we're reading this thing right now with the students who were in it from Volume 1. The Marx wrote this document called Results of the Immediate Process of Production. We're thinking, okay, we'd read that for the first 4 Sundays in June, and then I'm going to be the Sunday after, I'm going to be gone anyway, my brother-in-law's wedding, and then but then like we'd start off Volume 2 the first Sunday of July. I think the more we dig into this thing, I mean, it seems like it might take a little bit longer than that. So I'm thinking maybe we, we'll sort of continue doing that, through July. So if you want to join the Volume 2 class, you got some time. I think we're probably not starting until maybe the beginning of August. But, if you've, if you're already in the few, the proud, who have made it to the end of Capital Volume 1, it's not the biggest club. Those of us who've read all of Capital, and I don't know, all of Infinite Jest, should all share a cab someday. But
I could share half a cab with you because I read Infinite Jest, and I've bailed on a couple Capital classes.
Catch up on Capital. But no, if you are, you've always meant to read Volume 2, I think it can be kind of tough reading if you're doing it by yourself. But, if you're doing it, with a group of people who are doing it with you, that can help a lot. So, and also if you do still need to catch up on on volume 1, then if you do join the class, like you do join the Patreon capital class tier, you'll sort of immediately get the access to all 33 of the class recordings from chapter 1, right? So if you want to kind of go through it with those, and I should say, at some point we'll make like nice high quality versions of capital lectures, so we can actually put those all out on YouTube, David Harvey style, for everybody. But it's that's a little bit of a long-term project. I'm not 100% sure when that's coming together, how. But so meanwhile, right now, if you join the Patreon, you just pick the capital class tier, then you can get access to all that stuff right now.
Real quick though, brother-in-law, that's someone who's married to your sibling, but you're going to your brother-in-law's
well,
wedding.
so I don't fucking know. Maybe I'm getting the terminology wrong there.
Well, we'll get to the bottom of it in the
Okay. Hold on. This is all about language. Noam Chomsky and Jordan Peterson, with their different contributions to language.
There might be a different type of brother-in-law than the one I'm thinking of. It's
okay. So what do you call the person what do you call the sibling if the person your sibling is married to? Is there a name for that?
Wow. Okay.
I've had this debate with my wife, and I gave up.
Jamie.
Hold that up.
Yeah. All right. I'll look it up while you're talking to Nathan about whatever you're talking, Chomsky and all that shit. No.
there is.
Joseph says no. Half brother.
Joseph says no. Now, who are you going to trust? Joseph, who is a human being. I actually know he's at various times been in versions by Capital Class. Or are you going to trust the algorithm? Because when I go on to Google to test this extremely important question, then what I see says AI overview. A brother-in-law is the male relative of your spouse's family or the spouse of your sibling. Specifically, it refers to the brother of your spouse or the husband. Now, hold on. I thought I saw a more inclusive definition somewhere here that would help me out. All right, we are actually going to do it. Jamie, pull that up style and just keep looking until we find one that agrees with me. So,
all right, I'm glad I brought that up. I don't feel like anything has been derailed at all.
Yeah, no, this. You know what? Actually, we're going to tell Nathan to come back next week because I think we're going to have to get to the bottom of the terminology question. What you call this person?
But before that, do we have any other housekeeping to do before the opening argument?
Actually, so let's see. So we've got, I should say, actually, yes. So, and we might have to, because we got a little bit of a late start this week, we might have to make a command decision about the timing here and whether to save what we had prepared for next week. But in any case, I do want to say, while I'm thinking about it, that I think on Thursday night, we are going to be doing a joint Patreon movie night with This Is Revolution. So it's going to be. Let me see if I can find this to get it right. What it is. So it's gonna be all right. Enter the Ninja is the name of the movie.
Classic.
So 1981.
Yeah, Shokazuki.
Is it a classic or is it an Andy classic?
It's a cult classic. It really is.
Okay, that's another word for
yeah.
I haven't heard of
a cult movie.
I know a lot of movies, but
there's a trilogy, dude.
Okay, all right.
Well, we had this whole discussion about this earlier on the TIR group chat, because about whether I could participate in this, and I I mean, it's just one of those things that, like I've had like for the last day, this nagging feeling that I'm forgetting something about my schedule on Thursdays. I was like kind of trying to think about the week. It's like, okay, I've got to do this on this night and that on that night. And we eventually established that if I ever do figure out what I'm forgetting about Thursday, and if it conflicts, I'll just blow it off and say, I'm sorry, I forgot I had to watch a ninja movie that night. So I'm sure it'll be fine. You know?
Anyone that you want to keep in your life will understand, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right. We are, I'm actually, yeah. So this is to a great extent my fault. There were various delays when we got going in this episode, some of which were on me. But I think it's going to work out. So the opening argument I was going to do was going to be, the sort of starting point of it was going to be about this article that I wrote for Unheard. I think we have the graphic for that. The 21st century belongs to Marx, tycoons, tariffs, and empire all over again. And what that was is it's a review essay about Jodi Dean's book, Capital's Grave, Neo-Feudalism and the New Class Struggle, and Bruno Liipold's book, Citizen Marx, Republicanism, the Formation of the Social and Political Thought of Karl Marx. And I believe you were just showing, Dean had written a response for Sublation. Yeah, so that's her book, Capital's Grave, Neo-Feudalism and the New Class Struggle. And I think you just showed a minute ago, Dean wrote a response in Sublation, Analogies and Tendencies, a response to Ben Burgis. And I'd written a response to that called Service Workers Are Not Servants, response to Jodi Dean, which we might or might not have the graphic of right now, but it doesn't matter. And in any case, so I had this whole thing prepared on that, but we can do that next week, and that's actually going to work out because our guest next week is Bruno Liipold, the author of one of those two books that I'm talking about in the Unheard essays. So if you tuned in for the neo-feudalism, you're just going to feel brutally cheated right now, but you will get the neo-feudalism at the beginning of next week's episode. Meanwhile, as a reminder, in the postgame for patrons, we're going to be talking about Jordan Peterson's, we're going to be watching some of Jordan Peterson's Jubilee appearance. Good fun to be had there. And I will see both of you guys then. Meanwhile, we are joined by the man who ChatGPT described as approximately similar to if Oscar Wilde and Bernie Sanders had a son who was homeschooled by a Victorian ghost. That is current affairs editor Nathan J. Robinson.
Hey, Ben. Nice to see you. Always nice to see you. But do you want to know what ChatGPT said about you?
Might as well.
Because I said, well, that's very funny. That's very funny. Victorian ghost, haha. But if you were to give a similar description of Ben Burgis in a similar vein, what would you say? And they said, Ben Burgis is like if Slavoj Žižek and a longshoreman teamed up to raise a kid on a strict diet of verso books, diner coffee, and YouTube debates. Can you argue with it, Ben? Can you argue with it?
Honestly, that's kind of fair.
I mean, that's what I had to say too about mine. I had to say, it knows us too well.
Yeah, that is actually entirely fair. Well, so the occasion for you being on the show tonight is that you co-wrote a book with Noam Chomsky called The Myth of American Idealism, how U.S. foreign policy endangers the world. And before we get into the content of this, I really do just want to take a minute. You co-wrote a book with Noam Chomsky. That's completely fucking cool.
Yeah, no, this is probably the highlight of my my life. certainly my career as a public intellectual. I mean, my God, the man is like, when you look at the list of the most cited thinkers in human history, it's like, it goes like, you know, Plato, Marx, Aristotle, Hegel, Chomsky. So yeah, no, it was incredible getting to do this. And I actually was able to bring something to the table, right? Because you think, what can I possibly bring to a collaboration with Noam Chomsky? But the cool thing about this book is that it's Chomsky's like depth of knowledge with my kind of prose flair. And I think we achieved a synthesis that is extremely satisfying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And yeah, I mean, this is something like, I mean, I've always, you know, I have been reading your stuff for, you know, several years before I actually knew you. And one of the things that I've always appreciated about your writing is that, you know, I mean, it's always very like accessible and fun, but it's not just that. I mean, it's like, I feel like a lot of people, you know, like you read an article or a book that they wrote, and the sort of sense that you get is like, oh, here's the stuff I know, and I'm going to like share this with you. Right. And, you know, it's not necessarily bad. Right. But I think the sense I always get when I'm reading your writing is like, here's something interesting I'm thinking about, and like I'm going to kind of invite you, the reader, in, and we're going to like figure this out together, right?
Yeah.
Like, and so yeah, I think it is a really cool. I think it is a really cool combination, and you know, and it's also synthesizing a lot of what, you know, Chomsky has been writing about over the last, oh God, you know, bunch of decades. Right?
Yeah, well, since 1967, essentially, when he started doing political writing.
Yeah, right. I mean, I remember, so there's like a really thin book that he wrote called The Responsibility of Intellectuals, which is basically has to do with the Vietnam War, and that's certainly the earliest Chomsky thing that I've ever read.
Yeah, that's from the New York Review of Books. They republished it as its own standalone book in like an anniversary edition. But it was originally this essay in the New York Review of Books. That's one. I don't know if it's his first or one of his first ever. Because up until that point, he was political, but he had just been writing on linguistics.
Yeah, right. I mean, this is the, you know, right. I mean, he had those politics. I mean, I remember, God, you know, I remember watching that documentary, Manufacturing Consent, you know, long enough ago that I can vividly remember renting it from the video store, that it was like 2 VHSs with a rubber band. You know?
Oh, it's long. Yeah.
You know, one of those. And it was, and in there, I mean, there's a really striking story about, you know, his reaction to the bombing of Hiroshima, which like everybody around him was very happy about. And, you know, he was, you know, because, hey, great, we won, right? And he was very disturbed by it. And he like goes for a walk in the woods or something. And, you know, it does give you like some sense of the time scale here, right? Like, you know, exactly how long guy's been around. And, you know, he certainly had these political impulses. I mean, he, you know, he was, you know, like really interested in anarcho-syndicalism, and, you know, I mean, somewhat ironically now, you know, Zionism, right? You know, that like a point I saw him make many times is that, you know, as a sort of socialist Zionist youth activist before the creation of the state of Israel, what he advocated is now what would be considered to be an extreme form of anti-Zionism, right? You know, that it should be like, you know, there should be a binational, you know, Jewish and Arab state. So, you know, he had all these views forever, but, you know, he sort of kept himself busy revolutionizing linguistics and sort of laying the foundations for, you know, contemporary cognitive science. And, you know, it wasn't until the late 60s, when he starts to feel like, okay, with the United States is, whether or not you think it's exactly it according to Hoyle genocide is like certainly committing genocide level crimes in Southeast Asia, and it's sort of incumbent on me to like speak and write about this as well.
Yeah, and one of the things I tried to do in the book, because my kind of role in the book was to help him, to work with him to organize his writing and thought. There's some that's original to the book, but most of it is kind of woven together from observations he's made over the course of those 50 years. And he started with the conflict in Southeast Asia. He commented on Israel-Palestine, on the wars in Central America in the 80s. And I wanted to, because I think all of those things need to be revisited, because I think that his critique of the Vietnam War is so important and powerful, and we still don't understand what the Vietnam War was, and it's still most precisely explained in the pages of out-of-print Chomsky books. We have a chapter on the Vietnam War that really sort of draws together those arguments that he was making at the time.
Right. Okay. Well, let's get into this. So I want to get to the Vietnam stuff, fairly quickly here. But I want to start off, kind of chronologically here, where the book starts off, and like actually maybe even before that, just sort of, you've kind of said this already, but I mean maybe just sort of more directly. What's what's the overall mission statement here? Yeah. With this book. I mean, obviously we've kind of talked about like what you were doing with it, but I mean, like what's the sort of overarching thing, right? This is also, it's also, I believe, the only Nathan Robinson book that's ever been spotted at airport bookstores, right? So,
I saw it I've seen it in multiple different airports. New Orleans Airport Bookstore. I was because as a writer, it's long been my ambition to have an airport book. And I love that this is not what you would think of as an airport book, but this is my first airport book. Not
even a little bit, but okay. Somebody's at the bookstore at the airport looking for something new on their flight. They decide they don't feel like Stephen King today. They'd like a little informative.
Let's get a different horror story. Let's get the story of United States. How far away you think Stephen King freaks you out? Wait till you read our account of the bombing of Laos, because it'll give you some nightmares.
Yeah. So this person who's like coming in who might not like this wider audience that might be reading this, right? They probably aren't current affairs readers. They're like whatever, general interest readers. Like, what's the sort of biggest thing that you want to convince this person of? Yeah,
well, I think what's interesting about your question is that your question was what was in my mind going into the project, which is, but in a slightly different way, which is, okay, Chomsky has all this analysis of all these different conflicts, but what is the common theme here? What is, if you were to collect Noam Chomsky's works and you were to say, okay, well, what links his writing on Vietnam to his writing on Iraq, other than that it's anti-war criticism? And one of the things that came out of putting all these texts together and kind of noticing the common themes is the way in which a propagandistic story is told about U.S. conduct that is held by both Republicans and Democrats, that is a bipartisan story, and the way that story is totally at odds with the actual historical record. And you can trace the history of your country by reading all of the rhetoric about what your country did. Or you can trace the history of your country on a kind of different level, which is to trace all the facts of what your country. And one of what Chomsky has long done is said, well, let's set aside the official propaganda. Let's set aside what you're reading in the op-ed pages of the New York Times, and let's set aside what the president says, and let's try and go and find the facts of what actually happened. And so what this book does is go over the entire history of the post-war United States foreign policy and try and explain what actually happened, why it was done, who it was done to, what the consequences were for both the United States and the world. And it's a record of unbelievable violence and cruelty and unbelievable deception, to the point where even Americans who are quite cynical about their government, and it's a little different putting out a Chomsky book today when everyone's a little more cynical about, say, the Iraq War than they were in 2003, and a lot of Chomsky conclusions are things that you might hear Tucker Carlson or Curtis Yarvin or someone say something kind of similar about, elites, because a lot of Chomsky's insights have kind of percolated. But so what they get out of that is, you pick up the Chomsky book and your eyes are opened to not only what actually happened, but how people were deceived. And I really do think even those cynical people, even those people who think they know everything that happened, will find in this book things they didn't know about. Maybe they know about most of it, but there are things in the endnotes, because we have a giant section of endnotes, but there's so much that you are just not told about what happened. So if you want to understand your country, and if you want to understand its role in the world, and you want to understand who you are, where you come into the context of all that came before you, as Kamala Harris said, right? You need to pick up Chomsky, because Chomsky will help situate you and help you understand what the state is, what the United States is, and how power works in the world.
Yeah, right. One way to think about this, right? You start the book talking about mafia logic, and it's very often the case that the way people talk about U.S. foreign policy, I think somewhat less now for some of the reasons that you were just talking about, but even now, right, to a very great extent, kind of the worst thing that you could say about it is that we did something foolish or misguided. Yeah. That the Vietnam War, for example, was a mistake, a tragic mistake. That the invasion of Iraq, was a mistake.
Big mistake. Big mistake. So many mistakes.
Yeah, which is, at a certain point, right? It's like the sort of cliched, like Stalinist, looking back at at some dictatorship that committed terrible atrocities. Well, mistakes were made, right? And I think that a lot of the sort of breath of fresh air that I always felt like I was getting from reading Chomsky, and I think a lot of what's in this book is saying, no, we're not talking about mistakes. It's not as if that there was this sort of, attempt to do something else that just kind of through some bizarre series of accidents ended up, killing, millions of, Vietnamese and Cambodia and then, Laotian peasants, for example. Or, there was some basically noble thing that, that just sort of accidentally ended up destroying Iraq, right? So in the first chapter of the book, Disciplining the Global South, you start out by talking about Salvador Allende, and maybe for me, I've been accused of never being able to get past 2016, right? Everything is the sort of replaying of the original tragedy of lost Bernie election, but I always think of one of the most amazing moments from the Bernie Hillary debates, which was when Hillary said that Henry Kissinger was a good friend and advisor, and I'm not going to do a Bernie impression, but he said I'm happy to say Henry Kissinger is not my friend, and he brought up Salvador Allende, and you could tell that a lot of people in the audience and the moderator were kind of like, wait, who?
Yeah. The point that you're making here, this is one of the most crucial Chomsky insights, the things that really opens people's eyes, is Chomsky talks about the spectrum of debate that ranges from, if you take the Vietnam War, it ranges from well, it was a good war, and we shouldn't have quit Vietnam. We betrayed Vietnam. To it was a good war, but it was a catastrophe, and we couldn't win it. And that's what you read in the New York Times: is it was a disastrous war. We didn't achieve our objectives. Chomsky takes you in a whole different direction, where he says, well, actually, we did achieve a lot of our objectives, right? Our objective was essentially to make sure that the price of a North Vietnamese victory was extremely, extremely high, right? And we did make sure that essentially that the country was destroyed, right? So you can't, unless you're willing to see the country destroyed, you better not take on the United States. And this is where we get to this kind of Godfather logic that he talks about, where he says, oftentimes, and you see this so often, even in ostensible critics of the U.S. government. So like Stephen Walt, who's a great realist international relations scholar, still has a book called The Hell of Good Intentions, which is about, we mean so well, but all these disasters keep happening. There's a new book coming out by a Palestinian and American negotiator about the Israel-Palestine peace process. And they say, essentially, like, why is it? They're like agonizing, like, the Americans meant so well. They really wanted to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict, but they just couldn't. So all these mistakes, these terrible mistakes they made. And Chomsky comes along and says, no, the United States deliberately thwarted the peace process. Like, we deliberately made sure that a Palestinian state didn't come into existence. And there's a totally different way of looking at it, right? So there's the critics who say, well, the United States made all these terrible mistakes, and they're the reason a Palestinian state didn't come into existence, but, Bill Clinton was acting in good faith. And Chomsky goes, we weren't acting in good faith. We were vetoing UN resolutions all the time, affirming the Palestinians' right to a state. And I'll give you one more example. I recently debated an Obama State Department official at the Oxford Literary Festival named Edward Fishman. And he's a very nice guy. And I got through my spiel on the Chomsky book where I was explaining exactly this. I said, oftentimes the spectrum of debate, it ranges from it was good to it was bad, but we meant well. And I cite Samantha Power saying, the United States has never committed any crimes. And I said, so, they can't admit that we can ever commit a crime. The worst that we're capable of is a well-intentioned mistake. And then they turned it over. So I gave all of this, and I went through lots of examples here. And I said, these weren't mistakes. These were policy that was deliberately made and deliberately discounting the value of non-American lives. And their lives just didn't factor into the calculus. They turned it over to Fishman, the Obama State Department official. And he says, well, obviously, I agree with Nathan Robinson. The United States has made a lot of mistakes. Those mistakes have often caused right? And I was like, this can't even penetrate your brain. This concept.
Yeah, this is Marge Simpson trying to order coffee in Australia. Coffee, beer, right? Coffee.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's like so deeply contrary to the way the parameters of acceptable debate that that it's sort of like becomes kind of hilariously unthinkable. And I'm really glad, by the way, that what you just said, you brought up Walt and realism, because I think that there's thinking about the extent to which a sort of good Chomsky kind of skepticism about American foreign policy has or hasn't penetrated more generally. Something that I see a lot of, right, is that there are people on the right, especially, who will describe themselves as anti-interventionists. And, of course, one issue with that is, I think oftentimes when you really start looking into the details, not really, right? Like that they,
war. They want to do a different war.
Yeah, exactly, right. They don't like the war in Ukraine because it's, liberal coded, although God knows that might be changing, as Trump is president now. But the U.S. funding for Israel's demolition of Gaza, or don't want like a Cold War with Russia, but are all in favor of a Cold War with China, etc. Right? Like, so that's like one issue. But another issue is that the way that they explain it, like, weirdly assumes American idealism, right? I mean, the
Yes,
people
they're like, why are we doing this charity project in Ukraine?
exactly, right?
Like, yeah, like this isn't a charity. We're not trying to help Ukraine. What are you talking about? They like accept the premise that we're trying to help Ukraine because we care about, like, we're making a sacrifice because we really just care about the Ukrainians so much. And like, why would you care about the Ukrainians that much? And whereas, we know that it's like they saw a cheap opportunity to erode the power of a geopolitical rival.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like in a way, like a lot of this sort of, right wing, like half-assed non-interventionism that like at least sort of will claim an affinity to foreign policy realism a la Walt and Mearsheimer, is really always framed in terms of, if anything, I mean, it sort of becomes the foreign policy equivalent of like the Albert Hirschman in his book, The Rhetoric of Reaction, right? Talks about there's the futility thesis, which is for domestic politics, liberal do-gooders are always trying to do things to help people, but actually it never works and it can't work. You try to raise the minimum wage, you just get more unemployment, all this stuff. And it just becomes the foreign policy equivalent of that. It's like, actually the problem is that that naive idealists who go around the world trying to spread freedom and democracy, that don't understand the way the world works and don't understand the inevitability of self-interest, blah, blah, blah. And that's why you end up getting these disasters, like the war in Iraq, right? So, I mean, like,
because you didn't understand that the Iraqis, weren't capable of democracy. Because there could be a kind of racist element, right? Which is like, oh, you had too high of beliefs in the Afghans. You thought you could bring democracy to them, but they are these tribal peasants, and so they're incapable of this. Instead of like, well, you supported a corrupt and unpopular government that made the Taliban look desirable by comparison, which is the actual truth of the story.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, and in some cases, I think there really is a racist element to it, like Tucker Carlson, who started out as a big backer of the global war on terror, like when he was on Crossfire, right? That was his position, and I'm not sure what the exact chronology is of him sort of coming to be this like paleocon who's like skeptical of some of these wars, but I do know there's a recording that came out at some point of Tucker Carlson referring to Iraqis as semi-literate primitive monkeys. Right, and that does seem to have been some element in his thought process.
That's why the war was such a bad idea.
Right. Yeah. No. Exactly. Right? It's like, oh, well, you think these primitive monkeys can have like know how to have a democratic society like we can? Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or maybe the problem was that we got there and we fired the entire government, including all of the civil servants who knew how to do their job and keep the country running, and we told them they couldn't work anymore.
Yeah, right. Okay, so we'll get to Iraq, but I do want to start out in Vietnam, right? So this is chapter 2, the war on Southeast Asia, because this is. I mean, in some ways, I mean, Vietnam really feels like patient zero to me for this narrative about like bumbling American good intentions, right? The way that people talk about it as if Vietnam was this like patch of quicksand that the United States, through no particular fault of its own, got, people use these phrases like we got drawn into, the war, like, there's really no agency here, that it's like somehow or another there was this like gravitational, there was this gravitational pull of napalming this peasant society, which sort of couldn't help it.
Yeah. We don't have any agency here. Well, and the story of Vietnam as the calamity is still very much told in liberal circles. I begin with the Ken Burns documentary, right? So there's the 2017 Ken Burns documentary about Vietnam, which has this incredible quote, which is very similar to quotes that were from the liberals in the 70s, looking back on the Vietnam War. So we've got we open the chapter with Ken Burns' narration on the Vietnam War, saying the war was begun in good faith by decent people out of fateful misunderstandings, and it was continued through tragic decisions by presidents trying to muddle through. And Anthony Lewis of the New York Times had said in 1975 that it was a blundering effort to do good. And that story of the Vietnam War is still very commonly internalized by even Americans who think that the war was a bad idea, we should never have waged it. And a lot of Americans still think that it was a war for democracy. I saw John Fetterman about a year ago, I know you love him, had said something about the Vietnam War where he said, like, we were defending democracy in Vietnam. And it's just incredible to me. I mean, like, I don't have very high respect for his historical and knowledge and his knowledge of foreign policy, right? But I think it's an example of how, the fact that anyone could still say that we were defending democracy.
Just as a footnote here, by the way, I think you deserve a lot of credit for calling Fetterman sort of sooner than anybody else did. I mean,
I didn't know how bad he'd get.
Yeah. Well, I don't think anybody did.
He's worse than I had any idea he could be.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, I mean, during that election, I mean, I actually got some people on Twitter really mad at me because I wrote an article for Jacobin called "John Fetterman is right about many things, but he's wrong about how."
Yeah, you did. You get credit too.
And so that much, at least, I picked up on that he had this like terrible position on Israel-Palestine. But like overall, I was like, yeah, sure. Here's this guy who used, some like nice like economic populist rhetoric here and there. He's like, I was trying to, I sort of saw it as like, oh, he's got this like giant blind spot about Palestine, but I think like then it just turned out, I was like, no, he just sucks, like in general, like it's just awful, right? And
maybe he'll quit soon because he says he doesn't like doing his job.
Well,
he was complaining recently that they make him show up.
Well, I mean, as it turns out, you are just allowed to quit. I mean, like nobody's like it's not like you're going to get like sued for breach of contract if you step down from your Senate seat. Like you can just leave anytime. But yeah, like I think you were probably the lefty commentator I saw who was sort of most unimpressed by the guy.
The Nathan Robinson apology forums. There's like a meme that's like a Nathan Robinson apology forum, and you can check what you should apologize about. And it's one of them is like, I thought Fetterman was cool. Or like, I liked his posts. I liked the posting because he was, very, very sassy on social media. But one of the things
people enjoyed the way he was dunking on Dr. Oz, but I mean, I think the point you were making at the time was like, okay, but like, he's running for U.S. Senate. Don't we want to hear more of what Fetterman thinks about policy?
Yeah, we want shit poster in chief. That was one of the things that I noticed was, and this is why I think to go back to you'd say we are the Bernie bros who return constantly to the theme where you have to be like Bernie. But one of the differences that I noticed early on was if you examined what Fetterman was doing, you were like, wait, but there's no substance here. Like he wasn't criticizing Dr. Oz because he didn't support Medicare for all, right? He was like criticizing Dr. Oz for living in New Jersey. And it's like, okay, like, yeah, criticize him for that, sure. Right? Do whatever works. Just go after him. Say he's a carpet-bagging, rich guy who says crudité instead of vegetable plate or whatever. But really hit him on the fact that, like, he's a quack who instead of believing in universal health care, believes in, like, magic pills that he'll sell you on television. And he wasn't doing that. And that made me think, well, okay, do you really care about, the universal healthcare part?
No, exactly, right. I mean, it's like I think that the thing that at the time I was like, trying to give Fetterman some credit for is, being a good communicator, but then it turns out it's like, okay, but like looking back on it, like there wasn't actually very much being communicated, right? Like it's
when you looked closely, there was really not much substance there. Anyway, so
anyway, so
all of it to say he's also wrong about the Vietnam War.
Yeah. Which is, on a certain sense, like, okay, Vietnam War ended 50 years ago, so you think, it's maybe the least relevant thing that Fetterman is wrong about. But also...
here's what he said. Sorry. He said, this National Vietnam War Veterans Day, I'm reflecting on the service and sacrifice of the brave men and women who defended our freedoms in Vietnam.
Oh my God.
Our freedoms.
So...
As if, Chomsky calls this like the theory that Ho Chi Minh was going to get in a canoe and end up in San Francisco. Like, if you didn't beat him there, like, he was going to be on the shores of the United States tomorrow.
Yeah. I mean,
you didn't even say defending the freedoms of the South Vietnamese, which was the justification at the time.
Right. So, which at least would make slightly more sense. He's defending the freedom of Americans from. I mean, really, also, like, the United States is. It really, the United States is an extraordinarily well positioned country. I mean, we could, we could just like not have a standing army. We could just have like state National Guards, and it would be a really, really hard thing for anybody to invade the United States, right? Because it's surrounded by oceans on two sides, friendly countries on the other two, incredibly wealthy, et cetera, right? So, I don't actually think that the Viet Cong were in imminent danger of sweeping
peasant army that didn't even have shoes,
sweeping through the United States. But just just to kind of like start on this example, I mean, let's take the slightly less insane version of the Fetterman claim that the Vietnam War was being fought on behalf of the freedom of South Vietnamese people. What would be wrong with that?
So the standard narrative of the Vietnam War would be that there was communist aggression from the north, and South Vietnam was a free country, and we were defending the free country against the communist aggression from the north. And it turned out that it was very difficult to defend from communist aggression, and eventually we had to pour more and more resources into the war. It became unwinnable. The end. Standard story.
Right.
There are some complicating facts here. Daniel Ellsberg, in his memoir, he was working at the Rand Corporation, and he talks about how he came to the realization. He eventually leaked the Pentagon Papers, and how he came to the realization that this was not a noble war, but a war that was inherently morally wrong. Like, it was a bad war, not a good war badly waged or a good war doomed, a bad war. And he said the first thing that he realized was that we had defended French colonialism. So after World War II, the Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh, had issued the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence from French colonialism and said, post-war, we want to be an independent country. We don't want the French to take back this country after the occupation. And Ho Chi Minh recited the U.S. Declaration of Independence and pleaded with Truman to honor the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, to support Vietnam becoming an independent, free country instead of returning to French colonial rule. The United States supported the return of French colonial rule. Not only did the United States support the return of French colonial rule, but the United States funded the French occupation, even as the French were were finding it impossible to continue occupying Vietnam. And at one point, the United States was paying for something like 80% of the weaponry that France was using to maintain Vietnam under colonial domination. Okay, so that raises a question as to whether it's true that we care about Vietnamese self-governance, because we had a very clear opportunity to support the freedom of the Vietnamese, and instead we wanted them under a colonial oppressor. So Ellsberg says that was the moment when he finally understood that we had supported France occupying Vietnam, that he thought, well, clearly there's something wrong with the whole narrative here. And it turns out there's something very deeply wrong with the narrative, which is to say that the United States opposed elections in Vietnam. That's the core fact, if you want to make it about democracy and freedom, is that the South Vietnamese government was a dictatorship, and we were opposing consistently elections because we thought elections would elect communists, and we didn't want communists.
Yeah, I believe Dwight Eisenhower actually says that in so many words in his memoir that, of course, we couldn't allow an election in South Vietnam. The communists would have won.
Because Ho Chi Minh would win, because he was seen as a great patriot. He was seen as the George Washington of Vietnam.
Right. Yeah, I think that, like, seen in that light, right? I mean, like, you have this, this immense devastation, and it's really, like, immense to an extent that's actually, like, really hard to overstate, right? I mean, like when you look at the years upon years of the most powerful military machine that had ever existed, just pounding the hell out of this peasant society
with chemical weapons, napalm, Agent Orange, defoliating, destroying the crops, poisoning people, giving them cancer, dropping cluster bombs that go off for decades later. I mean, really, a couple million people, Vietnamese people, died in this war. This country is the size of Florida.
Yeah, right, exactly. And this is how you end up getting, like, I remember there's this Hal Draper article from just after the Tet Offensive where he basically says, look, I was always against the war, and, because if you basically saw what was going on here as a Vietnamese civil war that the United States was intervening in, I'm against that, right? But now it's clear that this is just not the character of this war at all, right? And that, and his evidence for that was the Tet Offensive, that you could have this huge populous capital city, like, there's weeks and weeks of preparation and people setting up weapons depots and stuff all over it, and not one person reports it to the authorities, right? That's something that you only get in situations like, occupied France, things like that, where, like, eventually you just get to a point where the population is just really united against, what they see as a foreign occupier.
Well, a really important point that comes out of the Chomsky analysis is Chomsky. And you start to notice this once you read textbooks and how much is focused on the bombing of North Vietnam, right? So there's all this controversy over the bombing of North Vietnam. And one of the things Chomsky points out is there's very little controversy over the bombing of South Vietnam.
Right.
And the reason is because that complicates the narrative of this as a war with North Vietnam, because it turned out that the bombing of South Vietnam was more extensive. Well, that's because essentially what was happening was a war between the unpopular South Vietnamese government and the population of South Vietnam, the peasant population that was turning against this oppressive dictatorial government. And North Vietnam intervened in the war and gave support to that peasant population, which opposed its government. But the United States, essentially, a lot of the time was at war with the South Vietnamese, right? The Viet Cong is a South Vietnamese group, not a North Vietnamese group, supported by the North Vietnamese, but it's a South Vietnamese opposition to the government. And so if you're fighting the South Vietnamese most of the time, then your whole narrative of protecting the South Vietnamese against North Vietnamese aggression. The other thing is that South Vietnam and North Vietnam are distinctions that don't exist in the minds of most Vietnamese people. This is an artificial boundary that's drawn in 1954 and has very little to do with, they don't see themselves as two different nations. It's just Vietnam as it is today.
Yeah, this is right, that's the lyrics of the old Tom Paxton song, Lyndon Johnson Told the Nation, we're sending 50,000 more to help save Vietnam from the Vietnamese.
Yeah.
I mean, there's like, right. There's one non-Vietnamese force fighting in Vietnam, which would be the United States. Again, even certainly initially, I mean, like, you started to get more of a North Vietnamese presence after actually in the Tet Offensive, much of the NLF was wiped out in that, right? But certainly for many years, right, the war is primarily being fought, against South Vietnamese insurgents, by the United States to directly continue the policy that began as an attempt to save French colonialism in Vietnam and prop up a profoundly unpopular government.
But we're trying to suppress a peasant uprising against the dictatorial government that we're supporting is not a narrative that you can sell back home. That's a much harder narrative to sell. We have
to draft your children to die so they can
suppress
do
this peasant uprising against our favored government here.
Yeah, exactly, right. So hence the ignore enough details and squint at just the right angle, and you can sell it as a war for freedom and democracy. And again, the reason to sort of go back and relitigate this now is the insane extent to which American discourse about this still treats it as if it was a war fought at least with that goal, however ineptly or tragically or unwinnably it may have been, right? Which is also, again, the template for how people talk about these these later wars, right? So
it's a colonial war. And Vietnam veterans, we have quotes from the book from Bill Earhart, who's a great writer who's a Vietnam veteran. He actually appears in the Ken Burns documentary, and he's a poet, and he's written for Current Affairs a few times. And what he says is that when he got there, he really thought he had internalized World War II movies growing up, right? So he's like a teenager, and he joins the Marines because he thought he was going to be Audie Murphy in World War II. He thought that he would be greeted by girls with flowers. And he said the first kind of mind fuck when he gets there is that the people of Vietnam clearly hate him. Like, they hate him. And he doesn't understand why they hate him. And then he starts seeing U.S. soldiers abusing the Vietnamese. And, like, they're instructed never to call them Vietnamese. They can only call them by racial slurs. And they, beating the crap out of them, casually killing them. He said he saw them, they had detainees who were for interrogation. And he said they were being tossed off they had their feet bound, and they were being tossed off a high truck, just tossed onto the ground, and they were breaking bones, like they're being moved around like sacks of potatoes. And he said he was like, but we're here to help these people. What is going on? And so he said it just did not make sense. He said it was totally and completely crazy and unintelligible because the narrative that he'd been given just didn't fit at all with what was actually happening in front of his eyes.
Right. Well, speaking of that, of course, the last American helicopter left Vietnam several years before I was born. But when I was in college, this happened, right? 9/11 and the wrecking of Afghanistan. And, this is something that, again, I think is, had, at least for a very long time, this very persistent, this sort of very persistent narrative that, it was, at least a fundamentally noble war, that, certainly at least a defensible one, that, that's like, oh, well, Iraq is something different, but, but Afghanistan, we had to do that. And, so I can remember, for example, if you go back and look at, Barack Obama beat Hillary Clinton in the 2008 primary in large part because, he could claim to have, been against the Iraq war because he gave long before, showing up in the Senate. He gave a speech in 2003 opposing the invasion of Iraq. And if you go back and actually reread that Obama speech, what he says is that Iraq is a stupid war. We are taking our eye off the ball of the war that we should actually be fighting, which is the war in Afghanistan, right? Like, so that was the sort of that was like the reasonable liberal position that, like, okay, sure, maybe Iraq is too much, right? But obviously, of course, we should be fighting in Afghanistan.
Yeah. And once again, Chomsky gives you a few facts that start to complicate the narrative, right? So in Vietnam, when you find out that the government we're defending is not a democratic government, that we're defending it against its own people, this complicates the narrative. Now, in Afghanistan, there are a few things that complicate the narrative. One of those things is that we emphasize in the early stages of the book is that anti-Taliban Afghans were horrified by the U.S. bombing of Afghanistan and were pleading with the U.S. to stop bombing Afghanistan in October of 2001 because they were saying, essentially, like, you're creating recruits for the Taliban. You're blowing up villages here. We've been trying to build an anti-Taliban opposition here in Afghanistan, and you're going to wreck all of this work. Another important fact is that 9/11 happens, and you might ask, well, what could the United States have done differently? But there's a really obvious answer, which is that the United States could have accepted the Taliban's negotiation overtures that were being made to turn over Osama bin Laden. So the United States threatens to invade Afghanistan and demands that the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden. The Taliban say, we'll hand over Osama bin Laden, but only to a third country and only upon you providing evidence of his guilt. And if you do that, we will hand over Osama bin Laden to a third country, not to the United States. This is a face-saving compromise, essentially. So they're not seen to be handing him over to the United States. And then he could face he could face justice, right? Yeah. He could face a court. He can face an international tribunal. The United States says, the Bush administration says, we don't negotiate with terrorists, right? You're a bunch of terrorists. We're not negotiating with you. You hand Osama bin Laden over, or we invade your country. Then the Taliban gets a little, drops the demand that he be handed over to a third country, just requires evidence of his guilt. The United States goes in, deposes the Taliban, right? They say repeatedly, we're not engaging in negotiations with the Taliban over Osama bin Laden. Massive missed opportunity, because what does it lead to? A 20-year occupation of that country, supposedly conducted initially in order to bring the mastermind of 9/11 to justice. Could have happened, possibly. We don't know how those negotiations would have gone, but might have been able to happen entirely without the 20-year occupation that ended in the restoration of the Taliban. So, good war?
Yeah, well, not to mention that when Osama bin Laden was eventually killed by the United States, which I don't I don't love that either, because because in general I think there doesn't seem to have been any attempt whatsoever to capture him, so he could have been put on trial, etc. It was just kind of a hit. But putting that aside, when that happened, right? Well, that was like a few special forces guys in a country that was not invaded by the United States, right? Yeah. So if that was the whole point was to get Osama bin Laden, then like the second that happened, I mean, that should have been like, wait a second, right? If you could just do something like this, why did you have to carpet bomb, invade, and occupy an entire country and spend 20 years, bombing wedding parties?
People also don't realize that the government we were supporting in Afghanistan for most of that time was totally corrupt and unpopular, that it just totally lacked popular legitimacy, that we were supporting just horrific, brutal warlords who'd been anti-Taliban, but certainly had no interest in democracy, that this government was, it was like the South Vietnamese government it was propped up entirely by the United States and dependent on the constant funneling of, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars. And without that support, as we saw when it was eventually pulled, the Taliban just immediately took over the country again. And that was what was going to happen because you hadn't created anything with any popular legitimacy in that country. So, I mean, no matter when you left, if if we left in 2005, if we left in 2015, or we left in 2021, they were going to come back.
Oh, well, surely if we'd just stuck it out for another 10 or 20 years, you know, then everybody would have grown to love the government we were propping up, because that's definitely happened.
The other thing that Chomsky points out is that we might not have the Taliban in power today if we had not invaded the country. And that's that's kind of crazy, right? Because we invaded the country to topple the Taliban. But the point that he makes about the anti-Taliban forces is he says the Taliban at the time we were invaded were unpopular, right? They were not popular. The people of Afghanistan were not pleased with the Taliban's rules, and there was organized opposition to the Taliban. He said, but our occupation turned the Taliban into the resistance force, right?
Yeah, right. And again, I mean, the sort of, I mean, really the brutality of that is pretty incredible, right? I mean, that, you know, the United States spent 20 years in that, you know, country, you know, I mean, doing things, you know, like house to house raids, you know, rounding people up. I mean, you know, we had you know, Guantanamo Bay, you know, was full of people who, you know, who somebody, you know, who were there on hearsay, right? You know, because they were picked up after the invasion, you know, and held in, you know, brightly lit cells on the other side of the world. Again, I mean, the fact that occupation, I mean, you know, it had.
Oh. Ben, I lost your audio there. And it looks like Jake can't hear you either. So there we go.
All right. Sorry about that. Yeah, you know, about like the degree of you know, like the degree of arrogance in that detail that, you know, that throughout like years and years and years, it had never gotten to the point where the occupying army had learned to tell the difference between you know, shots being fired into the air in a wedding celebration and Taliban attacks, right? I mean, that's that you had decades, right, of this stuff. I mean, the thing I mean, if you believed that the purpose of American, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. If you believe that the purpose of American involvement in Afghanistan was to you know, free the women of Afghanistan, to spread, you know, democracy and civil liberties and gender equality and et cetera to Afghanistan, you know, this doesn't seem like it would be the way to do it. I mean, this seems like exactly not how to win friends and influence people, right? But of course, I mean, this sort of characteristic of Chomsky point about this should be like, well, don't just assume that people's intentions are whatever they say, and then like be befuddled at the disconnect between that and what they do, right? I mean, like actually look at what intention would make sense given what they do.
Yeah, you know, one of the interesting things about Chomsky is how uninterested he is in intentions. I think you've probably discussed on this program at some point his exchanges with Sam Harris, and we might have talked about that together because it's an exchange over the value of intentions, of good intentions, in which Harris is making the argument, well, there's a huge difference between the morality of the United States and Israel, who do things for noble purposes, even if they end up killing way more people in just as gruesome of ways. And there's a huge moral difference between that and a suicide bomber who intentionally kills civilians. And Chomsky's basically not particularly persuaded by that because he's more interested in what he calls the predictable consequences of your actions. So if what you do is something you knew was going to happen and you chose to do it, then you might as well have intended the consequence. You know, you say, I intended the thing I knew would cause the consequence, but I didn't intend the consequence. I mean, Chomsky's not very persuaded by that. Like, I dropped the bomb on the house knowing that it would kill people inside the house, but I didn't mean to kill the people. I just meant to flatten the house. Chomsky doesn't see much of a moral difference between that and I dropped the bomb on the house in order to kill the people in the house. And certainly the same to the people in the house, right? I mean, there's no disputing that, like, from the victim's standpoint, these actions are indistinguishable. And in fact, the actions of the United States and Israel are far more bloody and brutal and worse than the much lower scale violence of our enemies. There's no disputing that the scale is different. The argument is that there's a big moral difference between collateral damage and intentional killing. And Chomsky's like, but you know that if you're dropping bombs indiscriminately, you're going to cause all this damage. How much different is that from terrorism?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one thing to say that intentions can be exculpatory if you had, you know, if you just didn't, if it really was like a sort of tragic situation where you had no way of knowing that what you were doing was going to have that consequence, right? You know, that you're, you know, backing, you know, the car out of the driveway and it turned out that there was a child playing hide and seek in, you know, a pile of leaves or something, right? Like, but on the other hand, if you drive through a playground, and you know you're driving through a playground, and like it could be that your intention is not to kill any particular child, but you know your intention is, you know, even if you're
just trying to get to work.
Yeah, just a shortcut, right?
I just don't care if there are any children in my way. I'm not trying to kill children. I just don't care if that. I mean, in your example, right? So backing out, we see not intention but knowledge as making the difference, as the key point of moral difference, right? Because if you know the child's behind your car, right, and you drive back out, it doesn't matter. If you know the child is behind you, we would actually consider you a total sociopath and monster if you were like, oh, yeah, no, I knew they were behind me. I didn't intend to kill them. I was just backing my car out, and I wasn't going to change the course of my action just because there was a child back there. I'm not trying to kill anyone. I mean, we just wouldn't accept that as a moral distinction between that and deliberate first-degree premeditated murder. It's like, if you knew you were going to kill someone and you did this thing, you're culpable.
Yeah. I mean, if there's a moral distinction, you know, you're still the you know, like knowing it and not caring is certainly bad enough that, you know, it's not an exculpatory distinction. So yeah, I mean that this is so in the Chomsky kind of view about this, I mean, what was the American goal? You know, what was the actual American goal in the war in Afghanistan for those 20 years?
Well, sadly, just to assert dominance and power after being struck, right? So 9/11 had been a humiliation to the empire, and so the empire struck back. George W. Bush had a quote we have in the book where he said after 9/11, he said, "I'm struggling to contain my bloodlust," right? And so it wasn't to obtain real strategic advantage is one of the kind of interesting things. Because, I mean, if you remember, I think some of the left-wing anti-war discourse in 2001, 2002 suggested that the United States wanted to build an oil pipeline in Afghanistan. And that's why I think that was even in Fahrenheit 9/11. But one of the things is we're trying to come up with explanations for why it could be strategic, because it certainly wasn't benevolent. But it also didn't seem particularly rational from a power building perspective. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries on earth. Maintaining a friendly government in Afghanistan doesn't get you many advantages as an empire. So I really do think it was we talk about mafia logic and The Godfather in the opening chapter, and it's a very good way to kind of understand things, which is to say that The Godfather may do things for rational, strategic power-building reasons, but The Godfather might also be just enforcing a rule that you don't mess with The Godfather. And when you do, if you go up and you kill his child, there's going to be revenge. There's going to be payback. There's going to be a price to pay for striking the powerful.
Yeah, right. No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, this is, this is like, I mean, I can remember leading up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a lot of people very confidently saying that, well, whatever saber rattling's going on, Russia's not actually going to invade the Ukraine because that would so clearly be an insane thing for them to do.
So it won't happen because human beings act rationally.
They'd have so much to lose, all of which was totally true.
Yeah.
But it turns out that empires aren't always rational actors, which I actually think that it's sort of. I think that given I mean, in that case, obviously, you'd also discuss that later in the book, but in that case, I think that. Given this sort of strong sense of being disrespected, having these various beefs with Ukraine and the West about, NATO expansion, about, the status of, Donetsk and Luhansk, all that stuff, I think not having gotten anything at the negotiating table, I think that again, I mean, this does feel very mafia-ish to me, right? I mean, it's like you could sort of imagine this as a Sopranos episode, right? One of the characters is, they feel disrespected at the sit down, right? So they start some crazy mob war that that ends up being incredibly destructive to their business interests. And yeah, I think Afghanistan looks a lot like that, and of course, Iraq ends up looking a lot like that, right? So I always think here of the late Henry Kissinger, who was
the dearly departed, much missed.
Yes, the much missed Dr. Kissinger, who is bizarrely.
If we're going to call him Dr. Kissinger, then you're going to call me Dr. Robinson, and I'm going to call you Dr. Burgess, because equally entitled.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But he, as many people seem to have forgotten, right? I mean, the guy, when he died, I mean, he was weirdly memorialized by some of these right wingers who call themselves anti-interventionists. I was on News Nation debating this, guy for the American Conservative magazine about Kissinger's legacy. And a lot of people sort of say, Kissinger was a realist, right? And they're contrasting that, with the neocons. And it's well, Kissinger was a confidant and advisor to George W. Bush at the time that he was doing all of this. And apparently, there's this story about one of Bush's speechwriters asking Kissinger why he supported the Iraq War, and Kissinger responded, and I quote, "Because Afghanistan was not enough. The radical Islamists," he said, "wanted to humiliate us, and we need to humiliate them." In other words, the presiding image of the war on terror, the burning towers collapsing television screen, had to be supplanted by another. The image of American tanks rumbling proudly through a vanquished Arab capital.
And you're where is the strategic thinking there, right? That's all emotion and image and but also Kissinger in Vietnam, right? The same thing, where Nixon and Kissinger wanted, peace with honor, right? Yeah. So we wanted to withdraw from Vietnam because they understood that the war could not be won, that eventually communism would win in Vietnam. But the United States couldn't be seen to lose very badly. So we had to maintain the prestige of the United States, even in exiting. And you think, okay, but how many corpses, if you know the outcome's going to be the same, how many corpses is your prestige worth? And it turns out, Kissinger's perspective, because he's a sociopath, was, well, it doesn't matter. However many corpses it takes to achieve our objective, which is peace with quote unquote a weird definition of being honorable, by the way. But Kissinger, by the way, another one of my favorite quotes is Kissinger was asked about the bombing of Cambodia, and he said, "I fail to see the moral issue." And I think to myself, so not only do you not accept the criticism, you can't even understand the moral issue.
Yeah, I will, especially given that Kissinger himself is on the Nixon tapes, memorably passing on the president's instructions for the bombing of Cambodia to Alexander Haig, said, being a man who could turn a phrase, said anything that flies on anything that moves, which, if you're applying that standard to an entire country, also a neutral country, by the way, that's that seems like doesn't actually seem like that should be difficult to see what the moral issue with that would be. But yeah,
real smart guy, Kissinger. He's a scholar.
Yeah, well, he talked about Metternich.
By the way,
yeah,
Chomsky's review of Kissinger's memoirs, very satisfying takedown. Someone got him to do a book review of Kissinger's The White House Years, and it's a delicious piece of writing.
Fair enough. Well, so since we have limited time left, and I want to make sure that
there's so many atrocities to go through.
I know there's so much to
so many atrocities, so little time.
Yeah, exactly. So I do want to be a little bit strategic about this and just hit a few that I think that it would be a shame to miss entirely. Starting with, of course, Chapter 5 on the United States, Israel, and Palestine. Because one of the things that's always been striking about Chomsky's writings about Israel-Palestine, which, as we kind of already noted earlier in the discussion, is one of his kind of longest-standing, geopolitical interests, is that most people who, most critics of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians will say, like, Israel did this and Israel did that, and maybe at some point in there it's bad that the United States supported that, right? But Chomsky will very consistently use phrases like the United States and Israel did this, the United States and Israel did that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like the South Vietnamese government, the Israeli government has been sustained for a very long time with endless U.S. support, and the United States has. So one of the things that Chomsky exposes about the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict is by making it the US-Israel-Palestine conflict, you better understand what is going on here, right? So the conventional picture is there is an Israel-Palestine conflict. That is to say, there was the Zionist project to establish a Jewish state in the land of Palestine. There were the Palestinians, who were the original Arab inhabitants of that land. There is a conflict over land. You can argue that Palestinians have the more just claim, but it is an Israel-Palestine. Now, what Chomsky brings in is the fact that the United States is part of the Iron Wall. Right, so this was Jabotinsky's phrase about how a Jewish state would be established in Palestine, which was that Zionists needed a bigger power to back them. And first that power was the British, and then that power was the United States. And the United States has always put its thumb on the scale, right, in this conflict, and always pretended to be an honest broker where the conventional picture, as I say, is the U.S. is looking at a conflict going on between Israel and Palestine, and the United States is trying to mediate, right? Yeah. But is not in itself an actor in that conflict. But ultimately, what Chomsky says is, no, the United States is the reason there is a conflict, right? Because there is an international consensus as to the settlement of this conflict. That is to say, Israel needs to withdraw to its internationally recognized borders, the 1967 borders, and needs to recognize the existence of Palestine, the neighboring country, right? The state of Palestine, which exists. It doesn't exist in US media, right? Where the AP style guide actually says, don't say the word Palestine, say Palestinian, but Palestine, you're not allowed, you're supposed to pretend this country doesn't exist, right? And so Chomsky said the United States is the force by vetoing Security Council resolutions, by providing Israel with all of the arms that it needs to maintain the status quo, and not being willing to put any pressure on Israel to agree to what everyone in the world agrees is the settlement to the conflict. That is to say, Israel has to recognize its neighboring country, Palestine. The United States has ensured the permanence of the conflict in this area.
Yeah, I mean, and this is really like, okay, so I mean, you kind of mentioned this earlier, but you know, the narrative about this that would be, you know, the sort of local example of the global narrative of American idealism, where, you know, you either have the sort of, you know, gung-ho neocon version of, you know, of it, that, you know, we're you know, fighting all these idealistic wars, and that's great. Or you have this sort of sober realist version. It's like, oh, well, we're, you know, keep trying to pursue all these noble ideals, but, you know, it just keeps on backfiring, and, you know.
In the exact same way.
Yeah, exactly. In eerily similar ways over and over again.
We're essentially, you know, Sideshow Bob in a world of rakes, to use a Simpsons. I know you like a Simpsons reference. We just keep stepping on rakes. Who put all these rakes here? I'm glad you like that. The stumbling empire.
Sideshow Bob in a world of rakes. That's
that theory of U.S. foreign policy.
No, exactly. The Sideshow Bob theory. We'll start using that. But yeah, but like, no, right, that's it, right? So the localized version of this is hey, look, well, I mean, George H.W. Bush, you know, forces Israel to the table in the Madrid peace talks at the you know, in the late 80s, which is actually true, by the way. I mean, this is the, you know, I mean, the, you know, actually like threat in the loan guarantees, which amazingly did get them to do that, which, you know, which might go to the general theory that you know, the U.S. is not particularly helpless in all of this, but whatever. So that happens. And then, you know, the sort of hero in this narrative, which is still very common right now, is big dog Bill Clinton. That, you know, that Clinton, right, you know, he had Rabin and Arafat, you know, on the White House lawn. You know, he tried really hard at Camp David to do a two-state solution. But as hard as he tried, the sort of, you know, fundamental irrationality of the actors on the ground stopped it. You know.
Well, and the Palestinians, you know, they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity.
Yeah. You know, which I know I've said this to you before, but I mean, like, I've really grown to hate even just the grammatical construction of starting sentences about Middle Eastern geopolitics with the group noun the Palestinians, right? Because, like, if you say the Americans did this or the Israelis did that, that can be a shorthand for the United States did this, the state of Israel did that, you know. But I mean, there is, at least in, you know, I mean, there is diplomatically, but I mean, like, as far as like what's going on in the ground, right? I mean, there's no Palestinian state, and you know, there's no mechanism by which Palestinians can collectively do anything right now. I mean, they're occupied, and, you know, sort of occupied at best, right? You know, and much worse than that in Gaza. And so, like, you know, it always seems like, man, if you mean the PLO, say the PLO. If you mean Hamas, say Hamas, right? You know, but it's like, don't talk about it as if this entire ethnic group were somehow collectively doing things, right? I mean, the sort of way we would all react if somebody said the Jews did this or that,
You're like, yeah, we don't have a committee.
yeah.
Like, we don't, there isn't like a, we don't all get together and have a decision as to what the Jews think on this.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
right?
and especially as we know that like the internal divisions between Palestinians have been actually very important to the conflict. Like, you can't understand it without understanding,
Yeah, right.
the intra-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, it turns out, like any other ethnic group with millions of members, not everybody has the same political views. Who would have thought? But okay, so yeah, this is the narrative that Bill Clinton really tried to deliver a two-state solution, but the Palestinians never missed an opportunity. Arafat walked away. That's why there wasn't a Palestinian state created, and at the end of the 90s. And since then, the United States, has largely been a helpless observer as things have deteriorated. But it's not really a prime mover in the conflict. It sort of benevolently tried to end the conflict, but that didn't work. And and since then, it's just a big mess, right? I mean, that's more or less the Israel-Palestine version of the American idealism narrative.
Yeah. And you see coming up I remember Hillary Clinton talking about the Palestine protesters, where she said, well, if Arafat had just said yes at Camp David, we wouldn't be in this mess. So this is kind of a foundational event for the story of everything being the Palestinians' fault, is they were given this generous offer. Now, a few complicating facts are, first, that Arafat initially said to Clinton, like, we can't have this 2-week solving the Israel-Palestine conflict at Camp David thing, because that's not how it works. He said, I have to build political legitimacy for a solution among the Palestinians. So you can't just invite me and go like, we're going to hash it out, and then we're going to say the conflict's solved and impose it. Like, there needs to be all this prep work. Like, as I understand it, Arafat's perspective was that when he went to the United States, that should have been like the signing ceremony for a deal that had already been worked out, right? But what Clinton wanted was, Clinton had this idea that you bring Arafat, you bring Barak, you get them in the woods, and you have them solve the Israel-Palestine conflict. And Arafat said, I'm not doing that. I don't want to go. He said, this is a trap. You're trying to set a trap for me where if it fails, because I'm given terms that I can't accept, it will be blamed on me. And Clinton said to Arafat, if you come, I promise I will not blame you if it doesn't work. I promise I will not blame you. And that's how he got Arafat to come to Camp David, was by saying, like, I understand that you feel that the prep work hasn't been done. I understand that you feel like this is not any way to establish a solution that is going to be politically palatable to the Palestinians. But if you come and it doesn't work, I won't blame you. And then when it failed, Clinton came out and he said, I am a failure and you have made me one, to Yasser Arafat. And after that, every time Clinton was asked, he was like, yes, it failed because of Arafat. The snake, Bill Clinton, after Arafat had told him beforehand, like, and so, okay, you can then ask, well, why didn't they accept the deal? And then Chomsky's gone into it. It's very interesting if you go to the Chomsky-Dershowitz debate at Harvard, where they talk about this deal, why what was offered at Camp David was totally unacceptable to the Palestinians, who basically had the idea from the beginning, like, what we want here is our rights enforced. And our rights enforced is Israel needs to withdraw to its borders, to its internationally recognized borders. And they're quibbling and they're saying, well, maybe we can keep these settlements, maybe we can keep these settlements, maybe we'll do this, maybe we'll do that. And they say, no, the Palestinian position was, we have a legal claim here. The resolution to the conflict is you enforce the legal claim, which Palestinians felt they had already forfeited so much by accepting this tiny fraction of historic Palestine and conceding that there could be a Jewish ethno-state in the rest of it. And so from the Palestinians' perspective, but from a roughly consensus Palestinian perspective, like, it was already such an injustice and such a difficult thing to swallow that asking for further concessions for Palestinians was outrageous.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, my position normatively, right, is that sort of basic liberal democratic principles mean that if you're going to rule over people for oh good God, what are we up to now? 58 years, then you need to give them citizenship in your state, and I think that the sort of idea of an ethno-state is kind of an abomination. In any case, right? I mean, which by the way, sometimes you tell people that, and get these bizarre responses online like, oh well, but you're fine with, and then they'll just like to make up out of thin air a bunch of ethno-states I'm supposedly fine with. I was like, where did I say I was fine with any of those, right? Like, I have, I think if somebody,
you know who that is? That's Mr. So You Think. I've talked about Mr. So You Think. Mr. So You Think is the guy who replies to anything you say by saying, "Oh, so you think," but, and you go, "No, that's a totally different thought that I've never expressed in my life."
Yeah, right. It's like, no,
Thanks,
I don't know.
So You Think.
I don't know where you think I said that I think that like Japan should be ethnically pure or whatever, but I've never said that. Right? Like, that's not, I don't think, I think that, I think everywhere should be for everyone. I think ethno-states are an abomination. I think there's a sort of very straightforward and robust normative case for a secular democratic one-state solution. Now, I think obviously the real world, the material world is a vale of tears, and you very like, if you can get something that would be real progress, then you should take it, right? If that's what's achievable. And so there's a sort of pragmatic case for saying, okay, well, since it's really difficult to imagine right now that happening, you can, if you can at least, if you can at least get Israel to accept a two-state solution, it's fine. But it's like, a real two-state solution would be that in the entire, that Israel withdraws to its internationally recognized borders, which would mean that in the other 22% of historic Israel-Palestine, which is already disconnected between two geographical units, that in that other 22%, in all of that other 22%, which, I mean, that's like, I mean, really think about that sentence, in all of that other 22%, right? And all of that other 22%, there's a real Palestinian state that, that would control the territory, have a Palestinian, army and navy, which, I mean, certainly if you're going to border this extremely militarized ethno-state with a continuous history of attacking its neighbors, you definitely need that, all of that. And nothing like that was on the table at Camp David. Nothing like that was close to being on the table at Camp David, right? I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu has bragged about the poison pills that he that he put in, that he sort of lobbied to put in these various peace proposals that he knew that Arafat and Palestinian negotiators wouldn't take. I mean, generally, like all of these proposals, it's always like, oh well, you can have this like demilitarized semi-state that would be pockmarked by annexed settlement blocks and Israeli military roads, and it was all kind of a bad joke from the perspective of like a real meaningful two-state solution. And it's really like, I think the sort of core wisdom in that Chomsky point, it's like, it's the US-Israel-Palestine conflict, is this is the kind of negotiating position you have when you are just extraordinarily unworried about having your great power sponsor ever drop you.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's quite obvious that Israel's position is, well, we don't really have to concede much to the Palestinians. So what we're going to do is we're going to preserve as much of the status quo as possible. And to the extent we can, just rebrand the status quo. And we're not going to change. We're not going to do anything more than that unless we have to. And since the United States position has been consistently that nothing could ever cause the US to withdraw support from Israel, Israel has absolutely no reason to agree to a Palestinian state. And so since the United States has made it clear it's not going to even support UN resolutions recognizing Palestine, that it's not going to sign on to the Arab peace plan, which all of the Arab states have offered full normalization of relations with Israel if it withdraws to its legally recognized borders and establishes a Palestinian state. But Israel's not going to because it doesn't have to. And the only way it would have to is if the United States made it. And not only by threatening to withdraw support, but we can end the conflict tomorrow by saying, here's the international consensus, right, which is laid out in the Arab peace plan. That's the solution to the conflict. The Palestinians will have agreed to it. Israel hasn't agreed to it. And we can end the conflict tomorrow by saying Israel will agree to withdraw to its internationally recognized borders. And if it doesn't, first off, forget about weapons aid. Second off, we're going to sanction you. Because we have the weapon, we have the immense offensive weapon. Now, this never enters the discourse, right? There's withdrawing U.S. military aid to Israel is barely palatable. But what never enters the discourse is the idea of treating Israel like we would treat other rogue states. That is to say, we are going to use the immense weapons that we have to discipline other countries in the world. That is, boycott, divest, sanctions, right? We are going to punish Israel if it doesn't. We're not just going to not support it, but we will punish it if it doesn't recognize international law and doesn't recognize a Palestinian state. And if you start laying down those terms, if you start saying, this international pariah, all trade will be cut off with this country. We will put secondary sanctions on anyone who trades with Israel. Why? Because they are a serial violator of international law. Not because we're anti-Semitic, which is what it'll make it, but because we're actually going to enforce international law. And if Israel doesn't recognize a Palestinian state, then we don't recognize Israel, right? That's it. Yep. Recognition for recognition.
Right. I mean, like the stuff you're talking about, to be clear, I mean, this is like, for example, these are tools that the United States is using right now, for example, against Venezuela, right? For it's the Maduro, be accused of, tampering with the last election, right? And I really would be fascinated by the moral calculus that says that, stealing an election justifies the use of these tools. And expelling millions of people from their homes at gunpoint, and et cetera, et cetera.
You know what else we do when countries don't do what we like? We threaten them with regime change. We say, you know what? Actually, we might have to use the military option here. We might have to, if the government of this country isn't going to do what we say, we might just have to overthrow them and put in a different government and make sure that they do what we say. So, I mean, if we treated Israel like we treat other countries, we would not just even be having a conversation about the withdrawal of military aid. We would be having a conversation about regime change, sanctions, and basically like bringing the country to its knees.
Yeah, right. I mean, which it's like, okay, I mean, I would be against invading it.
To be clear.
But yeah, that's it's a fascinating question why all these people who are much more open to that sort of thing don't want this to be on the table. People. I mean, I'm just kind of thinking about going down the list of people I disagree with about this who I've had discussions with in the last couple of years. Stephen Bennell, Brianna Wu. These are people who are generally in support of a muscular U.S.
Mr. Borelli.
Yes, that's exactly. It's like, yeah. I mean, I don't know. It's like, yeah. I mean, I'm a hippie. I'd be against sending in the Marines, to Jerusalem. But I have, but he's clearly not, right? So I don't know why he'd be against it. So yeah. Okay. Well, as we like, we're a little bit over time, but as we turn towards wrapping this up here. I did just want to last couple of minutes together, I did just want to broaden the discussion a little bit, because it seems to me like, Noam Chomsky, who I take great pleasure, especially after the false alarm last year, and the fact that he's that he's still with us, that he's outlived, for example, Henry Kissinger, etc. Good victory, small victory for humanity right there. And
Kissinger's just dead and Chomsky lives.
Exactly. But I want to, I think, from my perspective, obviously, I think Chomsky is one of the most profoundly consistent, commentators at that level of prominence who's out there. I mean, there's the sort of decade in, decade out, the stuff he's stuck by. But I do want to just kind of run by you at the end some of the sort of common counterpoints to that, right? For people who are like, no, he's actually not so morally consistent as all that, right? So I can basically think of, I'm cheating a little bit with one of these, but I can basically think of three, right? I just kind of like to lightning round here, right? So one of them is people will say, oh, you look at his early writings about Cambodia, that he was denying the horrors of the Khmer Rouge. So that's a sort of reflexive anti-Americanism, distorting his perspective. Actually, let's just start with that.
Well, the Khmer Rouge was supported by the Americans, right? We're the ones who tried to get the Khmer Rouge to keep Cambodia's seat at the UN, which I believe we mentioned in the book. We also caused the Khmer Rouge to come into existence through the bombing of Cambodia. They almost certainly wouldn't have taken power, and we in fact quote in the book the scholars of Cambodia who are like the U.S. bombing drove support for the Khmer Rouge. So being against the bombing of Cambodia, also against the Khmer Rouge. The thing is, Chomsky's an anarchist, so he was never supportive of the Khmer Rouge. Okay, just to be clear, like every totalitarian society is horrifying to an anarchist. So there was no point at which Chomsky was pro Khmer Rouge. There is a point at which Chomsky is criticizing double standards of evidence that are used on Khmer Rouge atrocities. And I actually don't think his work holds up very well. I think the atrocities turned out to be, Chomsky defends it, and he's got a pretty good defense because a lot of what he said actually was quite reasonable. A lot of the things that he said seemed to be fabricated or exaggerated, but also a lot turned out to be much worse than the reports that were coming out at the time. So I think that's a case where he didn't appreciate how bad the situation had gotten there, but that wasn't because he's pro-totalitarian regime. You can get facts wrong, and I think in a long career of examining facts, you're going to get facts wrong.
I'd also point out that it's like, I think that if you're coming out of the Vietnam War, in which there were routinely wildly exaggerated claims of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese atrocities, and you start to get what sound like hyperbolic claims, and your first instinct is to be suspicious, right? And to not initially buy it, right, until the evidence gets until more evidence comes in, and then you change your mind and say, okay, I guess this is happening. That doesn't seem obviously unreasonable to me. I mean, like it's not. I mean, I think that it's also just very strange to me how much of a staple of anti-Chomsky rhetoric this is, given that what you're talking about is somebody being initially skeptical of claims that were starting to circulate in the 1970s, and saying, I'm not sure I buy that, let's wait to see what...
Out of a skepticism of government narratives about official enemies and war propaganda, right? Not out of a desire to see a totalitarian Stalinist state imposed on Cambodia, which no anarchist ever would be, right? Excessive cynicism towards war propaganda.
Yeah, there are people. I mean, there are people on the left still amazingly to me, who do, defend various, forget the Khmer Rouge, the Soviet Union, whatever, right? Defend the record of these states. And those people tend to really dislike Noam Chomsky because they realize that he's not at all one of them, right? Like that he's been very clear over the decades.
Well, Chomsky's narrative of the Cold War, which is in this book, is also kind of interesting because he says like the United States and the Soviet Union were the mirror image of each other. They were two empires that both told a false story of what their government was like, right? The Soviet Union pretended it was communist. The United States pretended it was democratic and capitalist. And neither one of these things is true. The empires tell stories to justify themselves. Those in power tell stories. And no, that story pleases nobody because the American right is not going to be happy to have the United States compared to the Soviet Union. And of course, the leftists are not going to be happy to have the equivalence drawn between the US and the Soviet Union.
Right. I always think of, well, not always, but since I heard it, right, I've been thinking about my friend Kuba. His parents came over from Poland, and I remember, he told me that the first trip they were blown away by the individual freedom and consumer choice, and the second trip they were like, "Oh, wow, we thought the Soviets were lying about the homelessness and racism. I guess not, right?" The Chomsky phrase that's always stuck in my head is, the Cold War was fought between a regional gangster and a global gangster. Which if you think about, things like the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, et cetera, versus the sort of way the United States was doing a much grimmer version of a much larger scale. Yeah, I think is about right. But yeah, so is clearly the idea that Chomsky was ever was just sort of reflexively defensive of regimes like this, clearly wrong. I think there's a impulse towards cynicism about about war propaganda, about official enemies, that led him to initially get this wrong. But also, I find it kind of amazing that it's still such a staple of anti-Chomsky rhetoric, given that you're talking about some initial skepticism getting close to 50 years ago, and for the overwhelming majority of that time. Right. Chomsky in the 80s was very clear, right, on the horrors of the Khmer Rouge. In fact, to the point of the only instance I know of Chomsky actually supporting one country invading another country was Vietnam's intervention in Cambodia to stop the Khmer Rouge, right? To stop the what Pol Pot was doing. So it seems to me that if you have something like 40 years of if you have an initial period of skepticism and wariness about what was being claimed, and then you have 40 something years of yes, I definitely believe this happening, and in fact I'm going to bring it up all the time, right? If this remains, that initial period of skepticism remains one of the leading pieces of evidence that's oh no, actually this guy's bad news. Honestly, that strikes me as a huge unintentional tribute to him, right? it really takes
I know, they're grasping. And Chomsky, you can look at Chomsky's entire record. He's never defended an atrocity. Okay? He's never defended an attack on free speech.
Which actually brings me to one of the other things I was thinking of, actually one of the things that I really have always admired a great deal about Chomsky is that he's just so he's just so forthright and consistent about the free speech question. That there's a clip that's in that documentary I mentioned earlier, Manufacturing Consent, that I've always loved of Chomsky. Jake, I think we have this clip who trying to explain the basics of free speech to a group of reporters.
But are you denying that the gas chambers ever existed?
But I'm saying if you believe in freedom of speech, you believe in freedom of speech for views you don't like. Goebbels was in favor of freedom of speech for views he liked, right? So was Stalin. If you're in favor of freedom of speech, that means you're in favor of freedom of speech precisely for views you despise. Otherwise, you're not in favor of freedom of speech. There's two positions you can have on freedom of speech. Now, you can decide which position you want. With regard to my defense of the utterly offensive, the people who express utterly offensive views. I haven't the slightest doubt that every commissar says, you're defending that person's views. No, I'm not. I'm defending his right to express them. The difference is crucial, and the difference has been understood outside of fascist circles since the 18th century.
Is there anything like objectivity, or scientific objectivity, reality? As a scientist,
look, I'm not saying I defend the views. Look, if somebody publishes a scientific article, which I disagree with, I do not say the state ought to put him in jail, right?
Which is just, I think there are many things I like about that, but one of them is just that it really exhibits one of Chomsky's most characteristic virtues, which is just the sort of immense dogged patience that he brings to that, right? I mean, that's like because the distinction that he's sort of forwarded there is so mind-bogglingly basic, right? You know, that it's like, yes, I don't like the view, but I don't want to censor people who have the view.
The important part of the way, I mean, people have obviously heard the expression, you know, I disagree with what you say, but I defend your right to say it. But I think one of the important things he says there is even Stalin supports freedom of speech for views that he likes.
Right.
And what's crucial about that is that it means that a lot of people can look like free speech defenders who are not free speech defenders. And I think of, for example, the person who comes to mind is Barry Weiss, right? You know, all of the IDW people who were going, well, freedom for the canceled, freedom for the people who want to express, you know, transphobic views or offensive views that offend liberals. And you think, okay, well, but are you going to say the same thing when the view is being suppressed are Palestinian views, right? Because if you're not, then all you're saying is freedom for my speech, freedom for speech that I agree with, freedom for the speech I like.
Barry Weiss's University of Austin, I mean, recently, apparently, you know, I mean, I guess given the kind of contract they have, it wasn't officially firing, but they basically fired somebody for sort of making a mild defense of diversity as a goal that apparently really offended one of their donors. You know, which now I do want to say, I will reiterate my long-standing suggestion about this, which is like, let's say that story really got them wrong. Say they really do care about this stuff consistently. I think there's a very easy way the University of Austin could show this tomorrow, which is that I think they could offer a teaching position to Norm Finkelstein.
Yeah, that's right. You believe in free speech, right? You believe in, you know, protections for the canceled, right? Unpopular opinions. And Norm Finkelstein is totally on board with them on most of the. I mean, we just
all that other stuff.
We just got his book called "Burn That Bridge" when I get to it, and you know, it's all a critique of Robin DiAngelo and stuff. So
yeah, right. So
for some reason,
some strange reason, despite sharing a lot of their concerns, he's never been offered.
Finkelstein is like there's no more devoted acolyte of John Stuart Mill, right? There's no one who believes more in the principles that the University of Austin say they believe in. Finkelstein takes them really, really seriously.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, last one. What I've seen people bring up is, if you look at, you know, I mean, so there's all this, of course, lots of people, even some people on the left have, you know, been very hostile to Chomsky in the last couple of years because of his advocacy of diplomacy and de-escalation in Russia, Ukraine. You know, a couple of years ago, I wrote an article for the Daily Beast called "Noam Chomsky is Right. The U.S. should work to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine," which is, I remember I was talking to this about it with our friend Branko Marcetic at the time, and he was like, "Yeah, you know, you really would have thought people got mad enough about this. That's like, what's the big controversial within the left position taken here that peace negotiations are good and Noam Chomsky's right about something? That doesn't sound like hot takes, you know, in an intra-left context." But the case that I've heard a few people make goes like this. Okay, You say, Ben, or you say, Nathan, that Noam Chomsky is this incredibly principled, consistent person. But if you go back to what he was writing in the early 70s about Vietnam, he'd said, it shouldn't have to be a negotiated peace. We should just leave, right? And if you look at what he says about Ukraine, he wants there to be peace negotiations. So this is inconsistent. What say you, Nathan?
Well, I want to get to it. I feel like you're missing the big criticism of Chomsky, which is anti-American. Like the thing, because I wrote a whole article responding to Noah Smith on saying that Chomsky literally applies a double standard to the U.S. and other countries. But yes, on negotiations, I mean, I think what he would say is the United States shouldn't have been in Vietnam, right? There was nothing to negotiate. There was nothing to negotiate in that case because we had no right to be there. So the correct solution in that case is to leave Vietnam because there is nothing to negotiate. Whereas in the Russia-Ukraine case, you are facing an aggressor. So the question in both cases is, what can negotiations achieve, right? What are negotiations meant to do? And in a case where the negotiation would be meant to extract concessions in a situation where we're in the wrong, then of course you shouldn't negotiate. But in a case where you're actually trying to achieve something more just and fair, then you should negotiate. And that's a consistent principle.
Yeah. I think to put that slightly differently, right, about the core of what you're saying, it's like, look, if you, it's one thing to say, what the Russian anti-war movement, to the extent that it exists, obviously very persecuted, etc., right? But it's like, what the Russian anti-war movement should advocate is end the war tomorrow, end the war yesterday, right? But we're in a very different context if it's like, okay, but what should the United States do?
Right.
Then of course, the United States doesn't have the power to just end the war in Ukraine instantly, right? I mean, that Russia has that power in Ukraine the way the United States had that power in Vietnam, right? But
yes. And if Chomsky were advising Vladimir Putin, he would give the same advice to Vladimir Putin that he would have given to the United States government, which is that your obligation here is not to negotiate. Your obligation is to leave. Yeah, was fully opposed to the. He said the invasion of Ukraine was the worst crime since the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah, right, exactly. Again, seems like a profoundly, principled and consistent person to me. By the way, also seems like a sufficiently, dispassionate caller of balls and strikes that, far from being sort of reflexively anti-American. I mean, I've seen Chomsky on numerous occasions over the years, giving credit where credit is due about things about American society that are better than, many other countries.
Well,
in the world.
It's true. And I mean, he'd be the first to say that our laws on free speech are much better than Europe, right? And so there was this. I think you almost didn't bring it up because it's such a dumb criticism of Chomsky that it's almost not worth dealing with, the anti-American stuff. But I wanted it to come across really strongly in this book by compiling some of the stuff he's said about this, which is that. Noah Smith wrote this whole thing. Well, Chomsky just bashes America. And it's like, and there's the argument that Chomsky gives, which is, first, I criticize America more because it is the country that I live in and I'm a citizen of and I'm most responsible for the actions of. So there is a reason why you should not give equal attention to the crimes of countries that you can't affect if you are the member of a polity and you have the capacity through your actions to affect. He said, even if the United States were committing some tiny fraction of the violence and some massive, it was massively greater, the violence committed by some other rival power. He said, usually that's not the case. In fact, we're committing the worst violence. But even if that were the case, you should focus on the 1% that you could affect. And that's really
like when people say, why don't you tell Hamas to release the hostages? I always say, well, what's my mechanism for telling Hamas anything? I don't like. Do I have a Hamas representative I'm supposed to call about this?
Call your Hamas representative. and tell them to release the hostages. But then there's the separate fact that Chomsky's actually, and I listed this in some of this in that article, the number of countries that he has criticized, like the number of governments, like the Brazilian government, the Indian government, the Australian government, the French government, the Russian government. Like, if you go through all of the countries that he signed petitions for the Uyghurs in China, and he signed petitions for the Kurds against the Turkish government. He's been an ally to so many oppressed people around the world against authoritarian governments. So the idea that he singles out America and thinks, Smith said, like, oh, he thinks America's the only country that does anything wrong. You go, well, why has he signed so many petitions about fucking Turkey then? Why does he criticize Saudi Arabia so much? Our book is, being censored in Saudi Arabia because the book contains criticism of Saudi Arabia, so they can't sell it in Saudi Arabia because we talk about Khashoggi. So we can't sell this book in Saudi Arabia.
Well,
and you say he only criticizes America, for God's sakes.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, like, this is it's so stupid. I mean, like, I think, like Noam Chomsky, who comes out of the anarchist tradition, never said anything critical about the Soviet Union during the decades of his career that the Soviet Union existed. Do you think that, like, Noam Chomsky, again, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. I mean, that's one of my favorite moments in that Manufacturing Consent documentary is this clip of him arguing with some talking head, and, who's trying to get him. It's like, well, you care a lot about, say, like a Palestinian, life, but like not so much maybe about a Kurdish one. He's like, I've been members.
You know who that is?
Yeah, I don't actually remember now.
David Frum.
Awesome.
That's David Frum saying that to Chomsky as a young man. It's a roundtable of Canadian journalists, and Frum is doing this, and Chomsky just brutally humiliates him. What are you talking about?
Yeah, I've been on these like pro-Kurdish committees since forever, right? Which is really a
if there's one thing anarchists don't talk about, it's the Kurds.
Right.
It's like it's.
Yeah, no. Well, it's really a side of very deep laziness, right? That the David Frum's the Noah Smith.
Well, I don't think if you read just the introduction to this book where we talk about anti-Americanism, you could possibly the other important thing, the final thing about that criticism. There's the fact that yes, you should criticize the United States more. There's the fact that actually Chomsky does criticize that, and then there is there's the fact that I've forgotten the one. There's one more fact about this that's very important. It's late, man.
Well, it is getting late, but I think those two are certainly a very powerful combination on their own. If this is the sort of most powerful and most dangerous dispenser of violence in the world today.
And then there's the fact that these are all criticisms of the United States government and not the people of the United States. That's the other important thing. All of this is criticism of things that the state has done, and unless the people are the state, then there is no implied criticism in any sentence of this about quote-unquote America.
Yeah, I mean, is himself. Noam Chomsky is himself, fun fact, an American, but yeah, no, exactly. I think that's quite exactly right. Well, all right. So you cannot get the myth of American idealism in Saudi Arabia, but you can get it in the United States. We have
fine airports near you.
Yes. If you happen to be flying, you might actually find it in the airport bookstore. And if you are just at home and you want to order a copy to be delivered to your door, there is an order link down below the box in which you are watching us speak right now. So by all means, check out the myth of American Idealism. Very nice looking book on display for you there.
And if you love endnotes, boy, have we got endnotes for you.
I mean, who doesn't love endnotes? So there we go.
It's 100,000 words of text followed by 33,000 words of endnotes.
Yeah. All right.
And there are Easter eggs in them too. There's like jokes and bonus atrocities and.
Fair enough. All right, Nathan. We have gone so far over because it is always so much fun talking to you.
Because we're so interesting together, man.
Yeah. I think so.
All right. Oh, is
All
poor
right.
Jake still stuck in the? See.
Well, we've got Jake here. He's fine.
We missed you. Thanks.
No, you were interesting together.
Thanks for the.
Yeah. The only thing that ever complains is my back as I enter my 30s of sitting in a chair for a while. I started, but I was so engrossed that it made up for it. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we are going to go to the post game for patrons. It is going to be a shorter post game tonight, probably about half an hour. But we are going to watch some of Jordan Peterson's Jubilee appearance.
That is my reward, Nathan.
Where he's debating 30 children and losing.
It's like the Frank Grimes episode of The Simpsons, where Homer wins the contest to like design like a model of the nuclear plant, and that Grimes tricked him into entering to, and everybody's clapping, and Grimes will yell, "This is a contest for children." They're like, "Yeah," and he kicked their butts. Right?
Yeah, but he did not kick their butts. He got humiliated by the children.
It's like when Kramer's in the karate class for all children. But Kramer also does well.
Yeah, so it's not like these examples, because unlike Kramer or Homer Simpson,
Peterson forgot what the debate was about.
Yeah,
it was a debate. It was supposed to be a debate between a Christian and a bunch of atheists, and then they said, "Well, aren't you a Christian?" And he goes, "I'm not going to say that." And they're like, "Sorry, okay, take this to the post game. All right, have fun.
Yeah, we'll go to the
fun,
post game.
Right.
Nathan,
I'll see you.
if you should come to Los Angeles sometime. You could do a book event or something.
All right, and you should come to New Orleans. We're having August 8th. It's our 10-year anniversary. We're having a big party. And it's coinciding with Netroots Nation, which is going to be in New Orleans at the same time. So worth thinking about an August trip to New Orleans, my friends.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Well, that is worth thinking about. All right, guys. I will.
Thanks to Between the 101 and the 5. All right. Bye.
Well, yes, that is our friend Arun. I will see you possibly then, Nathan. To anybody who is watching who is not a GTAA patron, there's never been a better time to fix this flaw. Patreon.com/Ben Burgis, $5 a month. Get access to all the post games after regular episodes. The Discord server, sometimes you get early access to things. Mostly you get our undying love and appreciation for helping to keep this thing going. If you are already a patron, then you should already have a link with a hilariously inaccurate start time for the post game in your inbox right now. Or if you don't see it, go again to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. So if you are already a patron, we will see you in that post game in like, I don't know, a minute. Left is best.
Wait, we have the Ben's song first.